This is Gene Krebs.
Hi there. Oh. Whoop. Whoosh.
And we're high on Ohio.
We're going around this great state, and we're talking to people who know how things work, who have an influence on making Ohio work better, and have some distinct ideas on what we could be doing in the state. They see our problems clearly. It's my distinct pleasure today to be with Jim Mahoney of Battelle for Kids. And Jim, thank you very much. And one of the things we always ask people coming into this thing is, how did you get to be where you are here now, and how did you fetch up here?
I actually, as it turned out, was in my 15th year as a school superintendent in Eastern Ohio.
Okay.
And it turned out to be my last year when I got a call from a consultant who was doing a search for an initial executive director of Battelle for Kids.
Okay.
So I was interested, interviewed, subsequently was hired. Now it's hard to believe 13 years ago.
Okay.
As the startup for Battelle for Kids. And Battelle for Kids was started by a philanthropic grant of $10 million
Okay.
that Battelle Memorial Institute, which is headquartered in Columbus, gave money to the Ohio Business Roundtable. And they created a not-for-profit, and the goal...
I think I remember this now. Yeah.
They created a goal, which was, how can we improve student achievement in Ohio? And it was one of the early calls about using data. How might we do that? So the genesis of Battelle for Kids came from both the Ohio Business Roundtable and Battelle Memorial Institute. So that's how I ended up here. What's been a great story, maybe not for others, but for me, is how I've stayed here this long. But I've been really blessed to be part of the growth of our organization in terms of adding staff and working with now 15 to 17 states across the country on school improvement.
Okay, so 13 years ago, I would be amongst those to say that Ohio, indeed most American education, was a data desert. Okay, there was just not a whole lot of data. It reminds me of the battle back in '89 when the General Assembly was starting to say we need to do some testing, and everybody said it was the battle of the Lake Wobegon effect. All the students are above average, and every single superintendent said, "Oh no, my school district, we're really doing a great job here." The proficiency test proved that to be a lie, and we're still dealing with the after effects of it. Where are we going next on all this proficiency, the testing, the accountability issues do you see?
Well, I'm going to go back to your original assertion, which I really do think it was a data desert. And part of the reason that I came here, and one of the things that we've been really associated with, both positively and negatively, is this concept around value added.
Okay.
Because my belief early on was you cannot improve a goal you don't measure. Worse yet, you can't improve one you don't have. Now,
that's a powerful statement.
Well, one of the things that we liked
How's that hate mail coming in for you on that?
Well, one of the things that we like, though, is what measures we use. If I just want to measure achievement, I don't have to give tests. Let's just look up zip codes. Because we can save a lot of money.
Okay.
Because if I want to know just achievement,
right,
there's a high correlation to income.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons I like value added is that it measures the growth, where I start with kids and where I end up. I mean, I guarantee you right here, we're close to downtown Columbus. I could go find third graders who know 20,000 words and can read multiple books, and I have third graders who don't know all the colors in the primary coloring box.
Right.
And everything in between.
Yeah.
And teachers don't get to have a draft, so they don't get to, you get who you get. Yep. And our goal is, how do we take kids from where we find them? So part of this early measurement that we did, and still are involved with, is measuring growth. Because the way to get to higher levels of achievement is, look, let's ratchet up growth year after year.
And so you're hitting upon one of the key things. I remember, oh gosh, I'm going to pull this out of my distant past, but a professor of education at Mother Miami who talked about, he did the regression analysis of census data tracks and proficiency test scores, and he basically said there's only three things that matter: is your educational level of the parents, income level of the parents, if you have both biologicals living underneath that roof. And you know, that type of social determinism leaves a whole lot of people cold, and it's just simply saying, well, if you're unlucky enough to be born to low-income parents or a low-income single mother, you're doomed. And so how do we handle the issue of I mean low-income children from broken families? How do we educate those kids, do you think?
Well, I think poverty certainly impacts families and kids. There's
Right.
no question about it.
Okay.
But I think it is such a misnomer to suggest, again, I'm going to go back to value added. There's
You
no
can change this.
relationship between value added and poverty. There's no relationship.
Because you can, no child left behind in reality is what you're saying.
Well, no, I'm not talking about No Child Left Behind.
I'm not talking about the program. I'm talking about in reality. You can bring every child.
Yeah, I think that I'm trying to think. I may not have this exactly right, but you may remember this on Firing Line years ago.
Oh,
William
gosh.
Buckley. He used to love to take people down the road, and he's about 3 steps ahead.
Oh,
but he
yeah.
has Mortimer Adler on there. Mortimer Adler is a renowned psychologist. And they're having this conversation, and finally he hones in on Adler and said, and I believe I have this close to accurate. He goes, and Dr. Adler, do you really believe all kids can learn?
Yeah.
To which Adler gave one of the greatest replies I've ever heard. He said, and why is it that you don't? I'd much rather live with my hope than with your doubt.
Ah.
So, I think it's a misnomer to kids to suggest that you cannot become something that because is a limiting factor. Are there
Yeah.
some hurdles to overcome?
Yeah.
Absolutely. But what I can remember many years ago doing a principal training, and I'm in a very, very poor region of the state, and someone said, well, do you think our kids can really compete with some of the kids in the suburban areas?
Yeah.
And I grew up in a very poor region of southeastern Ohio, and I said, I'm really glad I had teachers who thought I might actually speak to people outside the county.
Yeah.
Or outside the state.
Yeah.
Poor performance is not a sin, but low aspiration is.
Yeah.
And I think the degree to which we raise expectations for all kids and expect more of them, that the greater likelihood. But if we predestine somebody, it's like, oh, well, you have this.
Yeah.
Well, I just think that's a mistake.
What this reminds me of, this is to a certain degree like a national security debate, because there's 4 times as many Chinese as there are of us. There's 4 times as many Indians as there are of Americans. And so when they say 1 in a million, it's a rather common occurrence. And for America to compete on the world stage means every single individual, regardless of race, economic background, has to be given the opportunity to rise up as far as up they possibly can on the food chain, intellectually and professionally. And this soft bigotry that we've encountered over the years. So there are programs out there that can correct for this, and the testing is the first step for that.
Sure.
Would that be a way to put it then?
Sure, it's a piece. It's a piece of information. Now, I have to tell you, it's interesting. Just last week, the newest PISA results came out. Mm-hmm. Now, OECD.
For our listeners, USP stands for not United States Postal Service.
It's PISA. It's the Program for International Student Assessment.
Right.
And every 3 years, about 70 countries participate.
Right.
They're 15-year-olds in a series of exams, and then we rank and compare people.
And usually we get beat both by the Finnish hockey team and by Finland in these test scores.
We do. Now, they've been doing this for 50 years, so it's not like we just started this international comparison. So what I fear is that we go to one extreme or the other. There are those people who say, look, we still represent the greatest economic power in the world. So obviously not doing well on tests has not been a detractor to us.
Right.
There's one side. On the other side is that, oh my God, America is falling apart. Lithuania is now ahead of us.
Right.
Now, somewhere in here, our goal isn't to be the greatest test takers. Now, they're measuring problem solving. So we can't just simply dismiss it. But to suggest that it's everything, it's not.
Who was the economist who talked about the invisible hand of the economy? Who was that? Scottish philosopher, economist, the invisible hand. He was once asked about the decline of Great Britain. He says there's a lot of rot in any country. What you also remind me of is one of my favorite books was The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, 1500 to 2000. Paul Kennedy came out in 85, 86, forecast the decline of both the Soviet Union and the rise of China, and he did it all by numbers.
Right.
And it was a fascinating book. Adam Smith was the economist. Couldn't pull it out. Age is catching up with me. But, all right, so what I'm hearing from you, we have this thing here we call myth busting. So what you're saying is, well, tell us then something, let me allow you to state it. What is the myth that everybody thinks is true and you know is not true? I think I know what you're going to say, but
I think there's a couple. I'm going to go back to your one about poverty.
Yeah.
I don't want to ever suggest that poverty is not a limiting factor, because it is.
But you can overcome it.
Absolutely. And I look at the growth that kids make, and we measure value added. There's no relationship between poverty. If I measured achievement, there's a strong relationship.
Okay.
So there's the myth that poverty is everything.
All right, then let me ask you a sort of a twofold question. How do we get them past junior high? Because it's so often that we can get these low-income children from low-income single mother families pretty good up the academic food chain until we hit junior high, and then we have problems. And that relates then to the issues that Ruby Payne has brought out with the culture of the low-income family itself being an impediment to the child moving up the food chain. How do you see us addressing both of those issues?
Well, part of this, educating everyone takes everyone. So it's not just the school teacher. It's not just the school principal. We need communities. I mean, I like what John Dewey said. He said, whatever the best parent wants for his or her child, then the community ought to want for all of his children. And we need to bolster community support because there's cultural implications for all this. And the last thing I want to do, though, is suggest a whole array of excuses.
Okay.
Because we need to raise expectations.
Yeah.
And we need everyone involved in helping kids. Because at the end of the day, the point you make, our kids are now involved in a world that is so dramatically different. I'm going to use an example. Now, I've been to China probably a dozen times. And I remember on one of the visits, I often tell I was in Hong Kong, and I'm meeting with a group of kindergartners. And I passed out bookmarks that a teacher had made for me to pass out to students. And I passed those out, and this little kindergartner looked at me and said, would you like for me to make a bookmark for you to take back? And I said, yeah, that'd be great. She said, do you want it in English or Chinese? And I laughed because it was a great reminder that the largest English-speaking country, it isn't the U.S. now, it's India, but someday it won't be India, it'll be China.
Yeah.
But our kids are going to compete in a world that I certainly couldn't have imagined.
Right.
And so being prepared, being competitive, being knowledgeable, learning is going to be the currency. And so those people are able to do this. Now, the good news, when Friedman writes, we've got a much bigger market now.
Right.
All of those things. So it's a world that's dramatically different that we're preparing kids for.
And frankly, I mean, richer, too. I'm going to assume, and assumption is the lowest form of knowledge, that we're about the same age. But when we both now drive cars that give us a higher standard of living than we enjoyed in the houses in which we were raised. Leather seats, heated leather seats, air conditioning, a better stereo system than you and I had in college. And they even come now with little color TVs that tell you where you are all the time.
Another myth-busting thing is we sometimes treat teachers as if they're commodities. A teacher is a teacher. The truth of it is, teaching isn't any different than any other profession. There are some folks who are extraordinarily gifted in this role. And we have evidence to suggest that they're extraordinary in helping kids to grow and become. We have evidence now. And we've learned from them. We've spent years studying the practices and things that they do to help kids make extraordinary academic growth.
Okay, so are our higher ed facilities, institutions, doing a good job of preparing the teacher that we need for 2017? Okay, we're filming this, by the way, at the end of 2013. I'm using that as the date because by the time they go through the student teaching and everything and all of that, but are we getting them there yet, do you think? Are we getting the right teachers in Ohio now, in America now?
I think that someone once said the biggest room in any organization is for the room for improvement.
Okay.
So I think the room for improvement in that is huge.
All right.
That we need to be preparing kids. When I say kids, I'm talking
Right.
about our young people who are becoming teachers.
Yeah.
In areas from using data, which
Okay.
we never did,
Okay.
to a whole host of things. You know, it's interesting. We've talked here a little bit about other countries. So we look at Finland,
Yeah.
and we think about how teachers are prepared there, and who we let in the profession to begin with.
Right.
So it's far more rigorous. So
Yeah.
I think there are things we could do to dramatically increase the performance of our pipeline.
Okay, so let me ask you this question. I'm going to, I'm going to channel my inner John Kerry, the John Kerry who's chair of the Board of Regents, and
Okay.
not the Secretary of State, but that John Kerry. And you're sitting here, and if you could get the Board of Regents to do something, not just in Ohio, but for all the various chancellors across America, your 17 states you work in, what would be, you would ask them, one thing to do to give us a better quality teacher going out in a few years?
Two things. Dramatically improve your selection process to begin with.
How do you do that?
You do
Make
it through a number of things, not just the ACT. I mean,
Okay.
I used to tell kids, and I still
Yeah.
believe this, your I do is more important to me than your IQ.
Okay.
So, but having said that, that's a piece. There's
Okay.
also the capacity piece around, is this really what you want to do? In other words, I think that we could be dramatically more effective in whom we selected.
Okay.
And then the second thing I would do is I would change the teacher preparation program. It would become far more clinical.
When
So
you
that
say
you're out in
clinical,
schools.
what's that? So
You're out in schools.
You're out in schools.
I mean, I have to tell you what, no offense to the large university I went to in Columbus,
Okay.
and I realized this was eons ago, I
Yeah.
never saw a kid till my last quarter.
Okay.
So, not that people don't do that, but it would become far more clinical in terms of preparation.
Okay.
It would be far more rigorous. So, by the time you took your place in that classroom, you were far more prepared. The other thing I would do is, because I produced you, I'm not done with you. This is the start, because ultimately we ought to track back. How did the kids who teach kids, how
Okay.
did their kids do?
Okay.
Because you, if you're University X, you stand by your graduates. They're prepared to teach kids.
Ooh, kind of like a J.D. Power and Associates follow-up on like we do for cars, user satisfaction. You're looking at kind of like the end product satisfaction. So it would be, and that could then go back to the professor, the teaching methods.
That's what we're doing in K-12. Why
Yeah.
wouldn't we do it not? You know, it's not accountability, it's not blame, it's ownership. You feel the pride of how your kids do. If I were at a higher ed institution, I'd want to stand up and say, our kids are more effective than anybody because we've trained them, we've enabled them with great experiences, and
Okay.
they're ready to move kids into the future.
Okay, then while we're talking about that, then I have a personal bias, and personal bias means I'm right in my own mind. But my personal bias is that strong on STEM, science, technology, math, engineering, and one of my concerns is that a few years back, we had nobody in Ohio who had majored or minored in math going to go teach high school math. They were usually had majored in football, okay? And high schools all across Ohio are littered with failed football and basketball coaches who went there, coached for a few years, didn't have a winning season, but because of tenure, they're still there, and they're teaching now geometry, and they teach it right out of the book because they never really were very good at math. why can't we get people who are good in math, I'll pick on math,
Yeah.
teaching math at the high school level?
Well, there are places where that. I think your analogy is a bit exaggerated.
Okay. Well, I was a
So
former,
let me just say that.
I was a former school board member.
I'm going to take.
Good.
But I think your point is that knowing content really does matter, particularly in math.
Right.
So let's if we want to encourage people, then we need. I'm going to go back to the selection process.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to people who are good in math. Look, we don't have any problem recruiting honor students in every subject area. Why wouldn't we recruit honor students to education and to make it not the default
Okay.
major, but the first one?
Okay.
So, I mean, I do think there are ways that we can recruit people to, whether it's STEM field or physics, those things exist. What you
Right.
describe exists.
That is a huge problem.
It is a problem.
I will do a small amount of pushback that, this is a massive problem, especially in a lot of your high schools where we have very few people, very, very, very few, who majored in math, majored in physics, majored in chemistry, actually teaching those topics in school. My chemistry teacher in high school actually has a degree in chemistry, and that was the rare egg.
Well, let me ask you, all right, let's just pretend here for a minute. Let's say you're in any business X.
Right.
And you need designers and engineers, and you can't find any. How would you get them?
I'd probably bring him in from overseas.
Okay. What else would you do?
Train them on site, but but that would require another level of testing, and I would probably still bring them in from overseas. If I couldn't find native-born
All
Americans.
right, let's say I take that off the board. You can't go get somebody overseas.
All right.
You have to deal with this country. What would you do?
I would probably identify early on math, young people in high school who have a predisposition towards math. I would offer them scholarships if they agree to go ahead and major in math, major in education, come out and be willing to teach math at a high school level.
You're going to find a way to
years.
incent and pay people.
Right.
I mean, that's what the private sector would do.
Yeah.
So I would argue it's no different in terms of whether it's math teachers, et cetera. But there's, as we begin to, one of the things that's a grand experiment going on
Right.
in this country, and here's what it is.
Right.
For years, and as a school board member, you know that, we've had
Former.
a step.
Recovery.
Well, that's
Recovery.
okay.
Recovery.
As a step and lane system,
Okay.
that rewards you for longevity and degrees, neither of which necessarily guarantee your performance.
Right.
So we have a number of places that are saying, can we take this large sum of money, which, because education is labor intensive, it
Right.
should be. The
Right.
most important asset we have to offer kids are great people to work with
Okay.
them. And the question is, can we distribute this differently that might help us get better results? Might we distribute it differently that would restore a certain degree of respect to the profession? I mean,
Okay.
that's a grand experiment that's
Right.
taking place.
Right.
So that's what we do in the private sector. But at the end of the day, I'm going to go back to how do we select kids who enter education? How do we not only recruit,
Okay.
induct, compensate, evaluate? See, we're big on the evaluation part here.
Right.
I have lots of books in here. I go to the bookstores all the time. I've never seen a book said, evaluated into greatness. Now, maybe somebody's written it, but we do a lot of it.
Yeah.
And it's like, how about if we select and support
Yeah.
instead of let anybody and evaluate?
So you touched on something, compensation, and should all disciplines of teaching, K through 12, should they all be paid at the same rate? That's a great it's a great practical controversy going on.
The answer is I don't know.
Okay.
What
you don't have the data for it.
Well,
then.
no, I don't have data, and neither does anybody else. It's very mixed. What I would argue is, and I really applaud the districts that are setting down unions, administrators, school boards, and they're saying again, can we take this large sum of money that we've been distributing in a step and lane system, and
Yeah.
might we distribute it differently that would help more kids?
Right.
That's a question that needs to be asked. What I don't have is a simple answer that if you did this, because we don't have the evidence to say that.
Right.
But I really applaud people who are willing to sit down and ask the question now.
Okay.
And say, how might we do this differently that would help the profession and kids both?
I've been asking that question for about 25 years, which is why there's a, I'm hated by some people. Let me go, so let me shift topics a little bit and long-term problems, okay? You're basically you're in a very good situation. You are the executive director of what I would label a think and do tank,
Right.
okay? You think and you do. But that also gives you the perception to be able to look slightly over the horizon to see what's coming. And so what keeps you up at night?
My fear is that we've become so data-driven, we are destroying the morale of teachers.
How so?
Well, I'll give you an example. Whether it's labels that we use, there are people who believe that we can take something so complex as teaching and learning,
Okay.
and we can give a test once a year, and we can parse out your contribution to that student score, and
Okay.
I can simply affix a label to you.
And it's that determined, it sounds very Calvinistic to me. It's, so what you're saying is that it's that one teacher, and there was no other influences. It wasn't the fact that the father went to prison or the mother started
Yeah,
doing
and the other part is, how do I measure, what good is it that a kid makes 3 years of progress with math, but never wants to do another math problem again? Inspiration is there. It's a little tougher to measure. So one of the things is getting this whole evaluation, improvement. You mentioned earlier, one of my favorite sayings is this: the grass isn't greener on the other side. The grass is greener where you water it.
Okay.
Now, if you
And you're wanting to water that data desert.
No, well, we did some of that.
Yeah.
We've overwatered it.
Okay.
I now want to water development, because that's how we get improvement. If I water judgment, I'll simply get blame.
Are you talking about then what I would call a portfolio for the teacher, where you're able to, it's not a simple number evaluation, your students that went on from
Sure,
here?
there are different components that, one of the things, we've studied highly effective teachers.
Yeah.
So we have ideas about what they do.
Yeah.
And it's based on evidence. That
Yeah.
it's not simply, the goal here is really effective teachers are able to integrate a variety of important things, like how do I foster creativity, and how do I get results, and how do I build relationships. This is a complex task.
Well, let me ask you this question. I often use the phrase Bobby and Betty Buckeye, which is the typical citizen of this great state. There's also Bobby and Betty Bourgeois. And in talking to them, when I tell them that you have some classes, some schools out there where the classroom will experience 100% turnover in the class year. Not a single student who started there on Labor Day
Right.
will be there by Easter.
Right.
And so how do you evaluate the school teacher, that building, that whole district, when you have this situation? And I tell this to the good people who live in Worthington or Upper Arlington or in Findlay, and they just look at me just aghast and horrified, going, "You've got to be kidding me!" And I go, "It's just always one step ahead of the landlord and the rent collector. These are people who live lives of really not quiet desperation." Okay, how do you structure this then? How do you evaluate those teachers that in the districts that are the most at risk, where we need to get these kids moving up the food chain, but we got to get them out of that? How do we do that then?
Well, I think there's no question the huge mobility that you discussed exists in very large measure in some places.
Yeah,
And
Columbus
it's a
City
limiting
Schools,
factor.
Cleveland.
So it does. But having said that, we need some of our finest teachers there.
Okay.
And I'm going to go back to, again, how you distribute resources. Another way of looking at this is, what if we encouraged financially our finest teachers to go there and to be there? Because, again, my fear is that because we have these limiting factors, that we use it solely as an excuse
Right.
for not helping kids.
All right, then let me give you a follow-up question then. I've always bifurcated the whole education dilemma into two halves, which may be false. It's governance and it's funding. Is that a false bifurcation? Is that a false division? Are the two really related and interconnected, or are they two separate issues, do you think?
No, I think they're absolutely interrelated. You know, as
Okay.
somebody who not only grew up, but
Where'd you grow up, by the way?
I grew up in southeastern Ohio,
But-
in Monroe County,
Monroe County, okay.
and but then worked in Muskingum County for many, many years, in Washington County. So, but I always found it interesting. Of course, money makes a difference. The only people that think money doesn't make a difference usually are the people who have
the
money.
Right.
But I think that it does make a difference. And there are resources that are unavailable in programs. I'll give you a perfect example. I remember going to the nearby university and talking to a group of kids there, and they were from two distinctly different high schools, both of which I knew.
Okay.
And as we went back and forth and compared the classes that they took and the facilities that they took classes in and labs, et cetera, it was so clear that they had such a different experience. And going to the one high school, every class the kid took was an AP class that they got credit for. In the other high school, the kid didn't know what AP was. Now, there's huge differences. Now, is it because the people here wanted less? Of course not. It was a resource
Tax
issue.
capacity.
And you know yourself that at the end of the day, it comes down to the property valuation.
Right.
And from there, everything emanates. So, but money makes a difference. But the idea that it makes the only difference, it's not true.
It's not true.
It's a piece of it.
Yeah. We could run out of film talking about a classroom instructional model and funding stream. Okay. We could run out of film, but we're going to do that shortly. So, which you don't have film anymore. We now put everything on a hard disk somewhere. Proving once again, I am now very old. We always ask people during these interview things, have you written and/or read a good book lately? And we're filming this in what looks like a small private library of books about education, management, negotiation theory, and some humor. I saw one back here from Rodney Dangerfield to boot, too. So what is the book or books that you've read, written, you find most inspirational, and what would you advise people watching this to read?
First of all, I love to read. And I'm going to go back to, I don't know who the reading teachers were that inspired a love of reading.
Okay.
But somebody might have measured their ability to cause me to know sight words for vocabulary, et cetera. But I'm going to go back to what we've talked about. Somewhere along the line, somebody fostered me a love of learning, and particularly learning to read.
Right.
And reading.
Right.
So the most recent book that I've read that really resonated with me is by one of my favorite authors, Malcolm Gladwell. In fact, 60 Minutes had a piece on him 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Okay.
And I've read all of his books, but his most recent book is called David and Goliath.
Oh, yes, I saw the reviews of that in the Wall Street Journal.
He sets on its ear that sometimes things that we think are distinct advantages are disadvantages.
Yeah.
And vice versa.
Yeah.
And that he uses this metaphor in the story of David and Goliath, that in fact David had some distinct assets that were to his advantage.
Right.
And Goliath just the opposite. And then his book goes through a number of very thought-provoking propositions about how we think about things. So it was very provocative in that. So I enjoyed the book, because one of the things you begin thinking about is, because we've always done that, is we need people who challenge that thinking and say, there might be another way to do this that's very different. And that in fact what you thought was a disadvantage. And I've thought about my own teaching career. I thought, when I taught at one of the poorest school districts in Ohio.
Lowest income.
Lowest property value too.
Right.
So there's lots of ways to judge.
Oh, you said
lowest
poor.
paying, I'll throw that in too.
Okay,
So
all
by
right.
whatever dimension you want. The only thing that wasn't low is we had great kids. We had great kids.
How were they great kids?
Because they were responsive. They were, and this is back in the early 70s when you would ask them to do something, they'd do it. Effort was huge. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed. I had just gotten out of the Army and went to teach in this school district, and families were incredibly supportive too.
Okay.
So I need to say that. So when I talk about poor, in part they were property poor. I
Right.
couldn't have gone anywhere in Ohio and made less money teaching.
Okay.
So when I talk about that, so I need to define what that meant. But the point is, I really, really had great kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt very, very fortunate. And what I saw as a disadvantage, I didn't even know was a disadvantage. We didn't have teacher editions. We didn't order anything. I didn't know what a purchase order was until I went to another district about 8 years later. Turns out that was the perfect environment for me because you
Okay.
had to be creative. You had to figure out things. So for me, it ended up being an advantage.
Okay.
And I wouldn't have changed
Okay.
that at all.
Okay. You know, talking about that, one of the things that you can still do it if you want, but when I interview people now for job positions and stuff, I ask them, so you have your strengths, but in many cases your strengths are also your weaknesses.
Sure.
So how do you prevent your particular strength from becoming your overriding weakness? And if they flub the question, they're done. What I'm really looking for is that sense of self-awareness.
Yeah.
Which if you can find that in somebody.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Greeks had it right. Moderation, there's a certain balance, stasis.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think they caught it, but you're right. It's for everybody. I
Yeah.
mean, I can. Enthusiasm is a great strength, but carried too far, people feel like they're being run over.
Yeah.
And patience is a great one until somebody finally says he can't or she can't make a decision. So we all have those, but I think your point about awareness and knowing that when you've gone too far and now it's a liability.
Yeah. Yeah. You see that all the time. So, well, this has been Gene Krebs, and on behalf of the Center for Community Solutions, we're high in Ohio.
For more about the Center for Community Solutions or their publications, please visit www.communitysolutions.com.